अस्सलाम वालेकुम स्टूडेंट्स, वेलकम टू माय चैनल। उम्मीद करती हूँ आप तमाम स्टूडेंट्स खैरियत से होंगे और मेरे तमाम स्टूडेंट्स का बहुत शुक्रिया जिन्होंने अपना कीमती वक्त निकाला मेरी वीडियो देखने के लिए। अब हम अपने टॉपिक की तरफ आते हैं। आज से हमारा जो टॉपिक स्टार्ट होगा वो एजुकेशन से रिलेटेड है। हम एजुकेशन के जो टॉपिक है इसमें हम सबसे पहले इसकी हिस्ट्री को डिस्कस करेंगे आज। और हिस्ट्री में जो हमारे पास सबसे पहला टॉपिक आता है वो है एंशिएंट ग्रीस पीरियड। हम इसके डिटेल से एरा को डिस्कस करेंगे, फिर हम इसके फ़िलासफ़र्स को वन बाय वन देखेंगे। उसके बाद हम देखेंगे कि इनके जो स्पार्टन्स बॉयज़ और गर्ल्स होते हैं उनको किस तरीके से तालीम दी जाती थी, और फिर हम इस तमाम टाइम पीरियड को जो है वो कंप्लीट करेंगे। सो लेट्स स्टार्ट द वीडियो। एजुकेशन इन एंशिएंट ग्रीस। Education for Greek people was vastly democratized in the 5th century BC, influenced by the sophists Plato and Socrates. Later in the Hellenistic period of ancient Greece, education in a gymnasium school was considered essential for participation in Greek culture. The value of physical education to the ancient Greeks and Romans has been historically unique. There are two forms of education in ancient Greece, formal and informal. Formal education was attained through attendance to a public school or was provided by a hired tutor. Informal education was provided by an unpaid teacher and occurred in a non-public setting. Education was an essential component of a person's identity. Formal Greek education was primarily for males and non-slaves. In some polis laws were passed to prohibit the education of slaves. The Spartans also taught music and dance, but with the purpose of enhancing their maneuverability as soldiers. 5वीं सदी कब्ल मसीह में यूनानी लोगों के लिए तालीम बहुत ज़्यादा जमहूरी थी, और जिन फ़िलासफ़र्स को बहुत ज़्यादा अहमियत दी जाती थी और जिनकी बातों पर बहुत ज़्यादा अमल किया जाता था उनमें सोफिस्ट, प्लेटो एंड सोक्रेट्स थे। कदीम यूनान के जो लोग थे वो जिम्नेज़ियम और स्कूल में तालीम को यूनानी सकाफ़त में शिरकत के लिए लाजमी करार देते थे। कदीम यूनानी और रोमियों को जिस्मानी तालीम की कदर तारीख़ी एतबार से मुनफरिद रही है। कदीम यूनान में तालीम की दो सूरतें थीं, यानी कि फ़ॉर्मल और इनफॉर्मल, रस्मी और गैर रस्मी। किसी सरकारी स्कूल में हाज़री के ज़रिए बाज़ाब्ता तालीम हासिल करना और उसे एक ट्यूटर जो है वो बाकायदा तरीके से एक तालीम देता था, ये एक फ़ॉर्मल एजुकेशन थी। और जो इनफॉर्मल एजुकेशन थी, जो गैर रस्मी तालीम थी, उसमें उस्ताद जो था वो बिला मुआवज़ा, यानी कि टीचर बिला मुआवज़ा जो है वो फ़राहम करता था, और वो एक गैर अवामी तरतीब में वाक़या थी, यानी कि एनी टाइम आप किसी भी वक्त किसी भी जगह पे ले सकते थे। कदीम एथेंस में तालीम का मकसद फ़नून लतीफ़ा में तरबियत याफ्ता शहरी पैदा करना और शहरियों को अमन और जंग दोनों के लिए तैयार करना, यानी कि उनकी तालीम का मेन मकसद ये था कि वो तालीम उनकी जंग में भी काम आए और उनकी रोज़मर्रा लाइफ में भी काम आए। 6 साल या इससे पहले तक के लड़कों को जो उनकी अपनी मदर होती थी, अपनी माँ होती थी, वो या किसी मर्द ग़ुलाम ने घर में पढ़ाया होता था, और 6 से 14 साल की उम्र तक के जो लड़के होते थे वो किसी मोहल्ले के प्राइमरी स्कूल या किसी प्राइवेट स्कूल में जाके पढ़ते थे। तालीम सिर्फ़ लड़कों को मिलती थी, सिर्फ़ लड़के ही स्कूल जा सकते थे। इनकी तालीम बहुत ज़्यादा एक्सपेंसिव, महंगी होती थी। स्पार्टन की जो तालीम थी एथेंस में स्कूलिंग से बिल्कुल मुख्तलिफ थी। कुछ लावारिस बच्चों को ग़ुलाम बनाकर उठाया गया, और इनकी तालीम जो थी वो ख़ानदानों या ट्यूटर के सपोर्ट नहीं की गई। 7 साल की उम्र के लड़कों को इनके घरों से निकाल कर आस्रे बैरकों में रखने के लिए भेज दिया जाता था, जहां इन्हें सख्त नज़्म ज़ब्त का निशाना बनाया जाता था। एजुकेशन इन एंशिएंट ग्रीस में अब हम डिस्कस करेंगे कि हमारे पास अब कौन कौन से इसमें सिस्टम्स आ जाते हैं, फिर हम वन बाय वन उन सिस्टम्स को लेकर चलते हैं आगे। सबसे पहले हमारे पास जो इनका सिस्टम आता है वो आता है एथेनियन सिस्टम्स, और क्लासिकल एथेंस हैं, और इसमें हम अब पढ़ते हैं ओल्ड एजुकेशन को कि सबसे पहले जो है वो इसका ओल्ड एरा कैसा था। ओल्ड एजुकेशन इन क्लासिकल एथेंस कंसिस्टेड ऑफ टू मेजर पार्ट्स, physical and intellectual, or what was known to Athenians as gymnastic and music. Gymnastic was a physical education that mirrored the ideals of the military strength, stamina, and preparation for war. Having a physically fit body was extremely important to the Athenians. Boys would begin physical education either during or just after beginning their elementary education. Initially, they would learn from a private teacher known as Pedagogy. Eventually, the boys would begin training at the gymnasium. Physical training was seen as necessary for improving one's appearance, preparation for war, and good health at an old age. On the other hand, music, literally the art of the muses, was a combination of modern-day music, dance, lyrics, and poetry. Learning how to play the lyre and sing and dance in a chorus were central components of musical education in classical Greece. Music provided students with examples of beauty and nobility, as well as an appreciation of harmony and rhythm. Students would write using a stylus with which they would etch into a wax tablet. When children were ready to begin reading whole works, they would often be given poetry to memorize and recite. Mythologies such as those of Hesiod and Homer were also highly regarded by Athenians, and their works were often incorporated into lessons plan. Old education lacked heavy structure and only featured schooling up to the elementary level. Once a child reached adolescence, his formal education ended. Therefore, a large part of this education was informal and relied on simple human experiences. क्लासिकल एथेंस में पुरानी तालीम दो बड़े हिस्सों पर मुश्तमिल थी, जिस्मानी और दानिशवराना, या एथेनियंस को जिम्नास्टिक और मौसीकी के नाम से भी याद किया जाता है। जिम्नास्टिक एक जिस्मानी तालीम थी जो फ़ौज की ताकत, सलाहियत और जंग की तैयारी के नज़रियात का आगाज़ थी। जिस्मानी तौर पर फिट जिस्म होना एथेनियंस के लिए इंतहाई अहम था। लड़के जिस्मानी तालीम या तो खेल के दौरान या सिर्फ इनकी इब्तदाई तालीम शुरू करने के बाद ही शुरू कर सकते थे। किसी की ज़ाहिरी शक्ल, जंग की तैयारी और बुढ़ापे में अच्छी सेहत को बेहतर बनाने के लिए जिस्मानी तरबियत को ज़रूरी समझा जाता था। दूसरी तरफ लफ्ज़ी तौर पर म्यूज़िक का फ़न जदीद दौर की मौसीकी, रक़्स, धुन और शायरी का मजमूआ था। मौसीकी ने तलबा को खूबसूरती और शराफत की मिसालों के साथ साथ हम आहंगी और ताल की तारीफ़ भी फ़राहम की। तालिब इल्मों को एक स्टाइलस का इस्तेमाल करते हुए लिखेंगे जिसके साथ वो मोम टैबलेट पर रहेंगे। जब बच्चे पूरे काम पढ़ना शुरू करने के लिए तैयार हो जाते तो अक्सर इन्हें हिफ्ज़ और तिलावत करने के लिए शायरी दी जाती। मैथोलॉजीज़ जैसे हिसिड और होमर के तौर पर भी एथेनियन की तरफ से बहुत ज़्यादा शुमार किया गया था और इनके कामों को अक्सर सबक के मंसूबों में शामिल किया गया था। पुरानी तालीम भारी ढांचे की कमी थी पुरानी तालीम में भारी ढांचे की कमी थी और सिर्फ नुमाया स्कूल था। It was not until about 420 BC that higher education became prominent in Athens. Philosophers such as Socrates, as well as the sophistic movement, which led to an influx of foreign teachers, created a shift from old education to a new higher education. This higher education expanded formal education, and Athenian society began to hold intellectual capacity in higher regard than physical. The shift caused controversy between those with traditional as opposed to modern views on education. Traditionalists believed that raising intellectuals would destroy Athenian culture and leave Athens at a disadvantage in war. On the other hand, those in support of the change felt that while physical strength was important, its value in relation to Athenian power would diminish over time. Such people believed that education should be a tool to develop the whole man, including his intellect. but higher education prevailed. The introduction of secondary and post-secondary levels of education provided greater structure and depth to the existing old education framework. More focused fields of study included mathematics, astronomy, harmonics, and dialectic, all with an emphasis on the development of philosophical insight. It was seen as necessary for individuals to use knowledge within a framework of logic and reasons. Wealth played an integral role in classical Athenian higher education. In fact, the amount of higher education an individual received often depended on the ability and the family's willingness to pay for such an education. The formal programs within higher education were often taught by sophists who charged for their teaching. In fact, sophists extensively used advertisements in order to reach as many customers as possible. In most circumstances, only those who could afford the prize could participate, and the peasant class who lacked capital were limited in the education they could receive. Women and slaves were also barred from receiving an education. Societal expectations limited women mostly to the home, and the widely held belief that women have inferior intellectual capacity caused them to have no access to formal education. Slaves were legally disallowed access to education. Women, while expected to stay at home and fulfill the role of a housewife, were still educated in such aspects. At about the age of 7, where boys and girls would exhibit distinct differentiation between sexes, girls were taught by their mothers the specific task related to a housewife as well as other moral education. After Greece became part of the Roman Empire, educated Greeks were used as slaves by affluent Romans. Indeed, this was the primary way in which affluent Romans were educated. This led to the continuations of Greek cultures in the Roman sphere. Classical Athenian educators as Socrates were an influential classical Athenian orator. Growing up in Athens exposed Socrates to educators such as Socrates and Gorgias at a young age and helped him develop exceptional rhetoric. As he grew older and his understanding of education developed, Socrates disregarded the importance of the arts and sciences, believing rhetoric was the key to virtue. Education's purpose was to produce civic efficiency and political leadership, and therefore the ability to speak well and persuade became the cornerstones of his educational theory. However, at the time there was no definite curriculum for higher education, with only the existence of the sophists who were constantly traveling. In response, Socrates founded his school of rhetoric around 393 BCE. The school was in contrast to Plato's academy, which was largely based on science, philosophy and dialectic. ये तकरीबन 420 कब्ल मसीह तक नहीं था कि एथेनियंस में आला तालीम नुमायाँ होगी। सुकरात जैसे फ़लसफ़ी नीज़ सोफिस्टिक तहरीक, जिसकी वजह से गैर मुल्की उसातिज़ा की आमद हुई, ने पुराने तालीम से एक नई आला तालीम में तब्दीली पैदा की। इस आला तालीम ने बाज़ाब्ता तालीम में तोसी की और एथेनियंस माशरे में जिस्मानी के मुकाबले में दानश्वराना सलाहियत को ज़्यादा से ज़्यादा रखना शुरू किया। तब्दीली रवायती के साथ इन लोगों के दरमियान तनाज़ा कशी की वजह से तालीम पर जदीद ख़यालात की मुखालफत हुई, यानी कि इन लोगों ने मुखालफत की कि हम सिर्फ जो है वो जिस्मानी तौर पर तालीम देंगे और इसके अलावा और कोई भी तालीम नहीं देंगे। लेकिन माशरे में वक्त के साथ तब्दीली होती गई तो और इसमें आला तालीम को भी जो है वो अहमियत दी गई। जो लोग बहुत ज़्यादा रवायत पसंद थे, उनका ख़्याल था कि दानश्वरों की परवरिश एथियंस सकाफ़त को ख़त्म कर देगी और जंग में एथियंस को नुकसान पहुंचेगा। यानी कि उनका ख़्याल था कि अगर हम इनकी सेहत पर, इनकी जो है वो जिम्नास्टिक पावर्स को अगर हम नहीं तवज्जो देंगे तो इससे हम जंगों में हार जाएंगे और जिसकी वजह से हमारे मुल्कों में हमें नुकसान पहुँचेगा, हमारी जगहों को वो लोग हमसे छीन लेंगे और दुश्मन ईमान हम पर हावी हो जाएगा। बेसिकली इनकी मुखालफत करने की वजह ये थी। दूसरी तरफ तब्दीली की हमायत करने वालों ने महसूस किया कि जब जिस्मानी ताकत अहम है तो एथेनियंस ताकत के सिलसिले में इसकी कीमत वक्त के साथ कम हो जाएगी। ऐसे लोगों का ख्याल था कि तालीम को इसकी अक्ल समेत पूरे आदमी को तैयार करने का एक ज़रिया होना चाहिए, मगर आला तालीम हमेशा की तरह गालिब रही। तालीम के सानवी और बाद के सानवी सतह के तारुफ ने मौजूदा पुराने तालीमी फ्रेमवर्क को ज़्यादा से ज़्यादा ढांचा और गहराई फराहम की। एथेनियन सिस्टम। क्लासिकल एथेंस। Plato was a philosopher in classical Athens who studied under Socrates, ultimately becoming one of his most famed students following Socrates' execution. Plato left Athens in anger, rejecting politics as a career and traveling to Italy and Sicily. He returned 10 years later to establish his schools, the Academy, named after the Greek hero Academus. Plato perceived education as a method to produce citizens who could operate as members of the civic community in Athens. In one sense, Plato believed Athenians could obtain education through the experiences of being a community member. But he also understood the importance of deliberate training or higher education in the development of civic virtue. Thus, his reasoning behind founding the Academy, what is often credited as the first university. It is at this school where Plato discussed much of his educational program, which he outlined in his best known work, The Republic. In his writing, Plato describes the rigorous process one must go through in order to attain true virtue and understand reality for what it actually is. The education required of such achievement, according to Plato, included an elementary education in music, poetry, and physical training, 2 to 3 years of mandatory military training, 10 years of mathematical sciences, 5 years of dialectic training, and 15 years of practical political training. The few individuals equipped to reach such a level would become philosopher kings, the leaders of Plato's ideal city. Athenian System. Classical Athens. Aristotle was a classical Greek philosopher, while born in Stagira and Chalcidice. Aristotle joined Plato's academy in Athens during his late teenage years and remained there until the age of 37, withdrawing following Plato's death. His departure from the academy also signaled his departure from Athens. Aristotle left to join Hermias, a former student at the academy, who had become the ruler of Artanis and Assos in the northwestern coast of Anatolia, present-day Turkey. He remained in Anatolia until in 342 BCE, he received an invitation from King Philip of Macedon to become the educator of his 13-year-old son Alexander. Aristotle accepted the invitation and moved to Pila to begin his work with the boys who would soon become known as Alexander the Great. When Aristotle moved back to Athens in 352 BCE, Alexander helped finance Aristotle's schools, the Lyceum. A significant part of the Lyceum was research. The school had a systematic approach to the collection of information. Aristotle believed dialectical relationships among students performing research could impede the pursuit of truth. Thus, much of the school's focus was on research done empirically. Spartan System. The Spartan society desired that all male citizens become successful soldiers with the stamina and skills to defend their polis as members of a Spartan phalanx. There is a misconception that Spartans killed weak children, but that is not true. It was a rumor started by Plutarch, a Greek historian. After examination, the council would either rule that the child was fit to live or would reject the child, sentencing him to death by abandonment and exposure. Spartan System. A gauge. Military dominance was of extreme importance to the Spartans of ancient Greece. In response, the Spartans structured their educational system as an extreme form of military boot camp, which they referred to as agoge. The pursuit of intellectual knowledge was seen as trivial, and thus academic learning such as reading and writing was kept to a minimum. A Spartan boy's life was devoted almost entirely to his school, and that school had but one purpose: to produce an almost indestructible Spartan phoenix. Formal education for a Spartan male began at about the age of 7, when the state removed the boy from the custody of his parents and sent him to live in a barracks with many other boys his age. For all intents and purposes, the barracks was his new home, and the other males living in the barracks his family for the next 5 years. Until about the age of 12, the boys would eat, sleep, and train within their barracks until and receive instructions from an adult male citizen who had completed all of his military training and experienced battle. The instructor stressed disciplines and exercise and saw to it that his students received little food and minimal clothing in an effort to force the boys to learn how to forge, steal, and endure extreme hunger, all of which would be necessary skills in the course of a war. Those boys who survived the first stage of training entered into a secondary stage in which punishments became harsher and physical training and participation in sports almost non-stop in order to build up strength and endurance. During this stage, which lasted until the males were about 18 years old, fighting within the unit was encouraged, mock battles were performed, acts of courage praised, and signs of cowardice and disobedience severely punished. The students would graduate from the agoge at the age of 18 and receive the title of ibis. Upon becoming an ibis, the male would pledge strict and complete allegiance to Sparta and would join a private organization to continue training, in which he would compete in gymnastics, hunting, and performance with planned battles using real weapons. After 2 years, at the age of 20, this training was finished and the non-grown men were officially regarded as Spartan soldiers. Education of Spartans women. Education of Spartan women, unlike their Athenian counterparts, received a formal education that was supervised and controlled by the state. Much of the public schooling received by the Spartan women revolved around physical education. Until about the age of 18, women were taught to run, wrestle, throw a discus, and also to throw javelins. The skills of the young women were tested regularly in competitions such as the annual foot race at the Haria of Elis. In addition to physical education, the young girls also were taught to sing, dance, and play instruments, often by the traveling poets such as Elsman or by the elderly women in the polis. The Spartan educational system for females was very strict because its purpose was to train future mothers of soldiers in order to maintain the strength of Sparta's phalanxes, which were essential to Spartan defense and culture.